So, welcome to chapter 11 of the Blue Marble Evaluation Book Club. You'll notice we have someone missing today. Michael is usually here, but he wasn't able to be here today. And we talked about rescheduling and then decided that since chapter 11 really focused a lot on some of the work that I've done with Dana Mortenson, with her organization, World Savvy, that we would ask her to join us and be our guest today. So I want to welcome Dana to the book club. Dana's also in Minneapolis and co-founded an organization called World Savvy that was the inspiration for the World Savvy principle, as you probably read in the book. So I just want to kind of kick us off with a little bit of an overview of the chapter and some highlights, and then start off the discussion. And I want to welcome you too to, maybe we won't go around and do introductions via video and sound, but if you want to go ahead and introduce yourselves via chat and tell us where you are joining us from, please do that. We would love to have everyone know who's here. And I'm going to share my screen here. Usually I don't have to do both the admin and the sharing, so there we go. So yeah, if you want to take a minute to add your pronouns to your name if you're able, and introduce yourself in the chat box, tell us where you're joining us from today. And then I also just wanted to just give us a moment to arrive in the blue marble space and take in the blue marble image. This is actually the original blue marble image that was taken in 1972, and it is upside down because the astronaut who took the image was zero gravity, and it's usually flipped when it's shared publicly, but this is my preference because it really, I think, challenges us to be world savvy in that way of like thinking differently, challenging our perspectives, thinking about things from a different viewpoint. And so just remembering that the reason that we're all here is because of our Mother Earth, and wanting to really center this blue marble image in our thoughts as we move into the conversation about what it means to be world savvy as blue marble evaluators. So I also wanted to center us in some very specific places, because I think, thinking about the world as a whole is critical, but also having that local connection is what I think inspires us to do this work often. And so I just want to invite you all to take a minute and just think about a place on the earth that is special to you, whether it's where you live or somewhere you visit, and what you know about that land, who the original inhabitants were, what's happening to it now. And this is a picture of Grand Lake, Colorado, where my mom lives, and we were just talking about it as people were joining the call, because it's a very special place to me. It's where my family got married, and this is what it currently looks like. It's on fire, and many of you have probably been hearing about that in the news or have personal connections yourselves. But the land is really being devastated, and it's not, this didn't come out of nowhere. And so I've really been challenging myself to learn more about the land and its history. And it was originally, the early inhabitants were the Ute people who spent summers and winters kind of traveling over the Rocky Mountains, the Continental Divide. And then as the gold miners came in the 1850s, the indigenous people were driven off the land into reservations. There became a national forest, Rocky Mountain National Park, but the land management just really was suppressing fires, and for many different reasons, it really ended up lots of properties were being developed, very large, expensive properties, and land management was not taking into account, the traditional indigenous wisdom. And it's a really good example of the butterfly effect that Michael talks about in the chapter, of something small having significant impacts around the globe. And this is the pine beetle that, produce these dying pine trees that are now ablaze. So I just wanted to take us kind of into the World Savvy chapter with that perspective of the globe, the local connections, and just the complexities that happen when so many different factors come into play, that are really important for us to understand and root any of our evaluation work in that understanding. So with that as context, and finally also the science behind the climate, the connections to climate change, and really looking at kind of how, looking back and looking forward, kind of where the fires are influencing one another and influenced by and having an effect on climate change and that interplay. So really our responsibility as evaluators and as stewards of the earth to hold all of that information and think about how do we translate that into action in our work. So that brings us to the World Savvy Principle, chapter 11 of the book. Hopefully you've had a chance to look at it, which is to engage in ongoing learning relevant to Blue Marble principles and practices. And as I said, that principle is inspired by the work of Dana Mortenson, who's joining us today. And so I wanted to ask Dana to jump in and kind of talk a little bit about how World Savvy is thinking about global competence and the connections that she is making in this work right now. So I'll pull this up to start, Dana, and let me know if you want me to switch it out at all.
Great. Thank you, Charmaine. And I also just included in the chat a link to the full global competence matrix that I'll reference as we're chatting. So as Charmaine mentioned, I'm Dana Mortenson. It's really a pleasure to be with you all. I think talking about World Savvy's work and global competence is how we frame it, particularly in these last 9 months, has been sort of unusually hitting close to home in the sense that, in my lifetime, we've not lived through a global pandemic of this kind where we all are experiencing something similar concurrently wherever we are in the globe, even though the degrees to which we're impacted by it are different. And I think, to me, sort of nothing more, illustrates that more deeply or more poignantly than that. And of course, it's not the only pandemic we're grappling with. Here in Minneapolis, and Charmaine knows this well, is sort of after George Floyd's murder, really sparking a much larger reckoning with racial equity and equity in general, and the interconnectedness between those issues and everything else, right? I think it's been the last 9 months has been an exploration of that. And so for us and for the teachers and students and schools that we work with, it really was an invitation we talk a lot about how to learn about and with the world and make sure that relevant learning is engaging young people in thinking about the complexities around them. This is real fodder for that, in ways that, have also had some tragic impact. And Charmaine mentioned, the other pandemic is just obviously environmental. So to step back a little bit, I can talk a little bit about sort of our sort of definition and our framing and how we came to think about global competence. The matrix itself was developed and redeveloped and was an iterative process and tool over about a decade. And we imagine will continue to be iterative as we move through the world and learn more and understand where there may be gaps or other things to include. The original journey that Charmaine was on way back when looked a little different than this. And so I want to start there because I think it's an important illustration of why and how we pivoted to what you now see as the matrix. The original way we thought about being world savvy and defining global competence included a domain around knowledge, where we worked really hard to identify, well, what would constitute being world savvy and knowing about the world and the space that you're in. And, if you think for a moment, and I see a lot of you are situated around the world, that is, it's such a subjective question. What knowledge, what are the 10 most important things to know about the world, or how you value knowledge and how you choose to present it, certainly in the educational context where we are, is so related to and subject to where you developed your worldview, where you live in the world, what influences and things have been a part of your upbringing and the formation of how you see and experience the communities around you. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So so knowledge was thereby removed for that reason. And a couple of things that we think a lot about is, I don't know how many of you have read Trevor Noah's autobiography, but there's a piece in the autobiography that leapt out and illustrated this so well to me, where he's talking about a friend that he grew up with, whose name was Hitler. I don't know if any of you remember this chapter. Hitler is one of Trevor's best friends growing up in Soweto. It was not, the fact that his name was Hitler was not something that stood out, quite frankly, or was significantly notable to any of them, because it was common for, people in his culture to be named after famous names of people. In the Western world, Hitler is often sort of weaponized as the worst thing you can be, right? It's the symbol of the absolute most catastrophic, most tragic, most monstrous sort of crime against humanity. And not to say that it's not terrible, but this chapter, they go to a Jewish school. They were DJs, and they were hired to go in and DJ a party for high school students. And they're introduced by the leader of the Jewish school, and they introduce his friend Hitler. And, I obviously can tell you sort of what happens from there. They're invited to leave. It's very offensive in the context. And the rest of the chapter unpacks the reality of, for these young people, where they grew up, what they experienced in South Africa, that yes, Hitler isn't a great guy, but for an African living in that space and place, King Leopold or there are people for whom the symbol that Hitler represents in the Western world is much more embodied that idea that Westerners would think about Hitler. And so if you're growing up in that context, we place a really high priority on learning about, World War II and the wars here, and understanding that piece in ways that, depending on where you are in the world, has different value and different prioritization in terms of what's necessary to understand the community and context. And so that example really sat with me, because I think it illustrates a lot of the reason we moved away from singling out knowledge as a domain that could be named and could be articulated specifically. What do you need to know? Another example would be, I grew up in public schools in New Jersey, and I could tell you the names of the ships Columbus sailed the Blue Sea on, but I couldn't tell you the indigenous land that my elementary school was on. We didn't talk about it. It wasn't mentioned. And so the choices around knowledge and what we need to know and understand to make sense of our communities is incredibly subjective. And so what we did as an alternative is, when we looked to isolate what are the skills and values and attitudes and behaviors, we spent a couple of years really researching and thinking about, well, if it's not knowledge, what are the sort of understandings about the world that sit as foundational underneath the development of these skills and values and behaviors, and framed them as core concepts. So what Charmaine has up are these core concepts. Yes, it is, Mathilde. It absolutely is. So we'll see that as we can get into this discussion, that it's another very big piece of it. The other thing I should mention in founding is that will help contextualize this. And you'll see some choices that we made that we still talk about. There's still discussion around it in this matrix. I co-founded the organization and ran it for several years with Madiha Murshid, who is Bangladeshi, Muslim, and grew up predominantly throughout the Mideast and then in Singapore. And so spent a small amount of time living in the US for school. And then when we founded World Savvy, but has been back in Dhaka for some time. So there's a lot of the discussion that you bring up around just the relativity and subjectivity of, you could even say that with skills. What skills are most important depending on context of where you are, what you need to know and be able to do. So I think in our discussion today, it's something I definitely invite everybody to unpack. When we return back to the core concepts, where we settled were what you can sort of see, it's a bit cut off on the screen, is really four pieces. One is an understanding and an acknowledgement that complexity and interdependence are defining characteristics of the world, right? That things are connected one to another, that they are very often much more complex than we can see, and that things don't often happen in isolation. That there are relational pieces to all of the events that we see. The second is that our own culture and our history is key to understanding our relationship to others. So really, we do a lot of work at World Savvy around identity, around trying to understand how do we understand ourselves and our own culture and our own history, and what about that impacts how we interact with others when we're in a new space, or when we're in a new place, or when we're taking in new information even. I think this last, well, many years, I would say, but certainly in an election cycle where we've had so much discussion about facts and attacks on media and information and what people do or don't believe about science. I've thought a lot about this idea of who we are, where we came from, and our own culture and background, and what it means about how we're interacting with new things we experience. The third is around multiple conditions fundamentally affecting diverse global forces, events, conditions, and issues. So this idea that it's very infrequent that a single thing has a cause and effect that's linear. We talk a lot with our students and teachers about global causes and global consequences. So we saw a picture of Colorado. We talk about these wildfires, the stories about whether it's in Colorado and their fires, or whether it's sea levels rising in Bangladesh, or whether it's the projections for climate migration here in the US between now and 2060. I saw someone's in Florida, my parents were there, projections around land loss and what's happening in these places, that it's not a straight line of cause and effect, that multiple things were happening across the world that had this influence. And so we talk a lot about, and use, I should say, in the educational context, inquiry-based models that allow young people, contrary to how education is typically set up, to place a priority on inquiry, to place a priority on asking deeper questions, to get to better and deeper questions, rather than sort of seeking only an endpoint with an answer, given that this tends to be true about so many world events. And the fourth piece for the historians in the chat, that history matters, essentially, that there is always a story, historical context, things that are operating in the places and spaces and among people that we're interacting with, that relates to and has an impact on where we find ourselves in the current moment. So it's a way to reinforce that and to place real priority on the investigation of that historical context as we're exploring new things we encounter. So I'll pause there for a moment, Charmaine, because I know we want to have a lot of time to chat, but I think if you look at the full matrix that I sent along, you may have some, what do I wonder, what do I notice? And to kind of let you inside or under the hood of what World Savvy talks a lot about, I'll give an example of, I'm imagining that this group, if we were to poll everyone, is fairly multilingual based on where I saw folks in the world. And we did not explicitly call out multilingualism as a cornerstone of building global competence. We've had robust discussion about that in the time since this was developed, and that may be an area that we changed. Asking around about is multilingualism sort of something to either strive for or continue to develop in order to really be able to build global competence in the deepest sense. What we did do instead is to include a piece in here about it's in skills around selecting and applying appropriate tools and strategies to communicate and collaborate effectively, which obviously falls quite short of talking about linguistic diversity. But at the time the discussion at the time, 10 years ago when we were developing this, was that what language and which language we placed a priority on at that point in time, Mandarin Chinese, and enrolling in Mandarin Chinese here was a real priority for parents and teachers and students. That the cognitive experience of learning a language was what was most important, being exposed to a lens on a different culture and the capacity to sort of see things through that process. But we've since had some pretty robust internal discussion around whether that's something that deserves and needs intentional naming in this matrix. And, talk a lot about how these different pieces interact with one another, right? The last thing I will say about it, and we can pause then, Charmaine, to talk about, whether we want to have some comments or questions or just some breakouts, or if there's another piece you want to talk about, is that this is obviously an incredibly comprehensive and robust matrix that when we think about evaluating this for our teachers and for our students, not all of these things are being developed in the same measure at the same time. And that this matrix and the building world savvy, or what we would call global competence, is an aspirational journey that's sort of never done, right? You're never arriving at a point when you've completed. I mean, the irony of us having a global competence certification isn't lost on our team, because it's not meant to be. One of the cornerstones is about lifelong learning. This idea that you never really arrive at a point where you could claim you're an expert or you're fully and completely globally competent, because the next day, the next week, if you're engaged in lifelong learning, you will learn something or encounter something that bumps up against a paradigm you've been locked in, or changes the way you see something that you may have believed and held dear for a very long time, or gives you a view into, or an insight or perspective into an issue that wasn't available to you for whatever reason prior to that. And so we stress that and really talk about this as an aspirational state, where the most important thing is the commitment to the learning and the cultural humility, the humility in this process of knowing that even as we build these skills and these competencies throughout our lives, that will never be sort of fully there. And so, as you can imagine, when we work in the K-12 education context and with higher ed as well, that's aspirational frameworks are not necessarily how that's set up, right? We tended to have, certainly in K-12, an industrial ed model that was like, there's a right answer, and you build the knowledge, and you get the grade, and you get a diploma, and you're certified as knowledgeable in this space. And so this last 18 years now has been a really interesting interaction with trying to redefine what is the kind of learning that actually prepares people for the world that we're living in. And just to bring back to the first comment that I made, which is, we are living in a space, whether it's the jobs of the future or how the climate will change both migration patterns and how we literally live and exist in the day-to-day and where we live, or if it's other issues that are more related to how are we going to build a democracy based on pluralism, and that leverages diversity as an asset as this country becomes more diverse, and do that in a way that doesn't tear us apart, right? What are the actual competencies people need to navigate that? And so it feels, I think, probably more than ever since founding, this sense of approaching learning and seeing the world through these competencies has sort of never been more important in terms of thinking about what it means to thrive. So I'll pause there. Sharma, is there anything else you want me to unpack? Or
I think that's great for now. And I think, the last piece for this group and for Blue Marble is just thinking about this connection between global competence and evaluator competence. And so Michael in the book kind of there's a lot of different models of evaluation competency. And in the book, Michael takes the AEA 5 domains, and then we sort of layer that into what that means for global competency. And so I would love to just kind of open it up to conversations, comments, and questions about global competence and how World Savvy and Dana have been thinking about it, and also in your own journey, like how you see that connected to evaluation competencies. So I'm going to stop the sharing right now so I can see everybody a little bit better. And maybe we can just turn to some questions. It looks like maybe Mathilde, you had a question about values, or maybe you already answered that one. Did that?
Yeah, exactly. I think Dana did answer about it. It was more, I was thinking when you were speaking, Dana, about knowledge, and that you didn't include it in the core competencies, because it's so context and personal experience dependent. I was thinking values, I guess, is also really cultural dependent. And yeah, but you
And I,
already raised this point.
yeah, and Matilda, I would just add to that too. When our students, which tend to be middle school and high school students, and now we're also working with schools of education, you're absolutely right. When issues of, they're looking at, it's a knowledge to action model that they use that's building global competence, but also trying to understand what informed action looks like in the world. Things like gender norms and cultural relationships to gender. This is, it's constantly in discussion as, we work with an enormous Somali population here in Minnesota. It's one of the largest immigrant populations and refugee populations settled in our state. And this also comes up as we work with the Somali community that, even intergenerational relationships and deference to elders and the norms in those groups is something that we're constantly in discussion about. So you're right. The answer is you really are right. And so we tried to frame what we framed when Madiha and I were working on this process and had sort of a global group of folks looking at it, to think about the things that allowed the most openness and the greatest capacity to apply that in a contextually appropriate way.
What other comments do people have? Please feel free to come off mute. We're a small group, so I don't think we'll break up into smaller groups right now, but just welcome your comments, questions.
Hi, Dana. This is Beverly. I just wanted to, I have up on the screen that PDF that you referred to, and I've been looking at it in terms of whether or not people would have a sense of the importance of their connection to being part of nature. By looking at this, I can fit it in there.
Yep.
But it doesn't, I can also easily exclude it. And
Yep.
So my question is, how do you use this, and what are you thinking in terms of what might need to be adjusted to bring people to the point of understanding that they are part of nature? I just think people don't get it. And capacity to protect nature and all, it is, I think, is very dependent on that understanding.
Absolutely. And I think I like the way you framed that, Beverly, this idea of like, I can definitely fit it in, but I could also leave it out. That, similar to multilingualism, is the conversation that's ongoing now at World Savvy, particularly as we're translating this matrix into a number of languages and working with a pretty diverse population. When we originally had the conversation, there's something that's singled out around a reflection on the context and meaning of our lives in relationship to something bigger. Oftentimes that's the place where we have a lot of reflection and discussion with teachers and students around, well, what does that mean? I'm part of a community. I live on this earth. What is this land? What's the significance of this land? How do I live in relationship with land? So not surprisingly, probably to you or anybody on the call, most of what young change makers in our programs, so students that are middle school and high school, in the last few years, recently, it's a lot of conversation about racial equity and racialized trauma, but environmental issues were at the top of the list of concerns for a younger generation that looks around and says, what are you handing to us, essentially? And so that's part of our ongoing conversation now. How explicitly do you call that out, and where does it show up? So yeah, it's a really astute observation. We've been in conversation around it. I think there's a few other things like that where you could fit it in, but you could omit it, that we're having some discussion around what level, degree of specificity in edits to the matrix are required.
I have a question, Dana. I know we're connected to our planet and universe and so forth, but my question concerns connectivity. What are your thoughts on that?
Connectivity in the sense, Tom, you mean
working like, around the world with each other, partnerships,
Yeah.
and so forth, yeah.
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts on that. So a lot of it shows up in how World Savvy applies the programming. So the belief is that you can see a couple of pieces here that really stress collaborative thinking and problem solving and shared responsibility, and the way that we think about connectivity and it shows up is that there's a very underlying assumption and a fundamental belief that think we can't do things alone, that we have personal individual responsibility, that but being connected to others and adopting both shared responsibility and cooperative action is at the core of building sort of a global competence over their lifetime. So almost everything that the young people we work with do in our programs relies on that they have to be working in diverse groups, that they have to be working with a diverse set of stakeholders so that they're taking in information and developing an understanding that's based upon that. And that's done in a lot of different ways. And I think we're also thinking about connectivity in the sense that in some ways, the generation that we work with now has never been more connected, right? If you think about it through the lens of technology, but potentially has also never been more isolated in a way. There's an entire examination we do around what AI has done to our lives in terms of managing algorithms in ways if we live in an online space where who we interact with and when is essentially manipulated by like groups, right? And so there's a lot of discussion that we're having now with both teachers and students around, well, what does that mean when you don't control those algorithms? And what does it mean around remaining connected in ways that actually give you the benefit of developing some of these things? You can't seek out a different perspective and apply it to decision making if the predominant way you're connecting is in an online space that's controlled by an algorithm that doesn't afford you proximity to diverse perspectives in that way. So I think in a lot of different ways, like connectivity is at the core. It's also, a great observation about this. What we talk about in schools is that there are just almost no challenges you can isolate that were either caused by or could be solved by one individual, one group, one nation state, any of that we're living in this blue marble concept in a way where this requires a collective. And so connectivity is at the core.
Tom, did you have any other thoughts as you were asking that question, how it comes up for you in your work? Or anyone else? I'm curious, as you are thinking about the matrix and the evaluator competencies and kind of what you bring to your work as evaluators, like what comes up for you as central? Where do you feel like you are pushing yourself towards as being part of this network to grow as an evaluator so that you can be more useful in the global change movement as evaluators, and also, push yourself to learn and into this World Savvy principle of continuing to learn and grow. Does anyone want to share where they're at in their journeys?
I'll share something that's on my mind. And this is my thinking and not others. And I'm not sure what I'm really talking about here. AEA has published, and the board has accepted a set of competencies. And I've reviewed, after reading the chapter, I reviewed our set of competencies, and I did not find any in there relating to what you express in the book as global competencies that are necessary to understand our planet and what an evaluator needs in terms of attitude, knowledge, skills, or behavior. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't see that in the set of competencies. Now, in the book, it's mentioned, I think, from guiding principles, or maybe from the standards. but it's not really explicit in my view or understanding. And others of you who are AEA members, can you either correct me or help me on this? Would appreciate it.
I think that's true. I think that the cultural competencies are kind of as far as it has gone in terms of thinking about cultural competence, but in terms of more of these global competencies, I don't think we're seeing them. And I don't know if Andre, Lisa, or others like have perspectives from other competency sets from CES or anything that captures it more, because I'm less familiar with those.
Well, I would just say that in response to both what you and Tom said, Charmaine, there are a number of these that I see aspects of it in the guiding principles. You know, I had worked on that task force, so I'm more familiar with that, and I'm not remembering all of the competencies off the top of my head. So, but you know, I guess the things that I'm seeing here, I was thinking about it from the perspective of each of the phases of evaluation or the major emphasis. Like I can see all those guiding how I would position evaluation. I'd see how I would work with data and the whole data exploration. I would see them fitting in terms of making meaning out of data, as well as ways of shaping and applying practice. So I kind of, you know, that tends to be a frame I tend to use for a simple way to look at it. And so, but, you know, for like humility comes to mind for one, you know, that's actually right in one of the guiding principles. And the thing that I was kind of wondering as I was reading it is, I think it's sort of like what I said before. You can easily fit it in or you can easily leave it out. I think I think this would apply to these if I looked at it in relationship to what I do remember about the competencies. But because there are quite a few things about understanding culture, understanding perspectives that are in those competencies, but they don't really line up quite like this. But
I'm happy to speak about the Canadian context, and I apologize, I'm not fresh and familiar on the AEA competencies, so I can't really compare them. But in 2018, we did refresh our competencies, and we added 4 in particular that I think are relevant to our conversation. And as in addition to refreshing our competencies, we refreshed our strategic plan and identified that diversity, equity, and inclusion and environmental sustainability are 2 overarching strategic values that are meant to be embodied and demonstrated through all Canadian Evaluation Society activities. And in fact, chapters have to report annually on how they have embodied those values in the activities that they're doing to implement the strategic directions. So specific to the competencies, we have a competency, I just actually had them pulled up here. We have in our domains, sorry, I'll just wing it. We have reflective practice, and we have reflective practice that commits us to thinking about the well-being of the coupled human and natural systems in which we're working. And then also we have in situational practice, we have a number of competencies, one that is specific to reciprocity, and that could be extended to reciprocity to the natural environment of humans giving back to the natural environment as part of nature, but it's not explicit that way. But there is an explicit interpersonal or situational competency that asks us to be responsive to both the human and the natural systems in which the coupled human and natural systems in which we're working. We also have a competency 3.7, competency domain 3 is about situational practice. And it calls all Canadian evaluators to demonstrate competence for addressing truth and reconciliation calls to action, which we committed to in 2015 as an organization. And so we've built that into our competency framework, and we're working on professional development to help evaluators to educate themselves about Indigenous rights, worldview, and our responsibilities in the systems that we're working in, even when we're not working in what has traditionally been called Indigenous spaces, recognizing that the entire country is an Indigenous space and that we're all treaty people. So there's reciprocity, there's truth and reconciliation, and then there's coupled human and natural systems as competencies underneath the expectation that we integrate diversity, equity, inclusion, and sustainability in all of our work.
One of the things, Charmaine, just to, it's in the educational context, but it's interesting because as you were just sharing, it was making me think of this. In 2018 also, OECD does the PISA test, which is the largest international benchmark for educational attainment across countries. I think there's 180 countries in it. And in 2018, for the very first time, they added global competence as a domain. And as you can imagine, the process of finding agreement on what that was quite cumbersome. And they just published the results. It took a couple years. So yesterday I saw the unveiling of the PISA results. Only 27 countries did the full battery. And I think 57 did some parts of that. The US opted out, which is, I think, also just emblematic of the moment of time we're living in. But Canada was sort of at the top of that list. So, that was one thing to mention. But the other interesting takeaway was those countries that were expected to do the worst, if there's such a thing in global competence, and I don't like using it that way, but had the largest gaps in terms of improvement. So Colombia was one of the countries that on academic standards in prior domains was typically in the bottom third. They were at the very top when their population of students was tested in this global competence domain. So as you're talking about CES and these other agencies looking at what the integration of these kinds of competencies mean across evaluation in their spaces, it's really, it provoked a lot of thinking among our team around how it's going to shift, really fundamentally shift dynamics about knowing and being and thriving in ways that may ultimately redefine goals for some sectors. For us, that's our hope in education. But you're sharing that, and it's like, it's also a props for those of you on the call who are Canadian, because you're clearly setting some good things in place.
I was reflecting on early in my career, back when I was actually connected to higher education directly. I was involved in the kind of the movement to create general education statements of general education outcomes. And typically one of those outcomes would be something about global competence or, some way of talking about that. And it occurred to me that one of the tensions in the general education space is between trying to come up with sort of universal skills or capacities or abilities and some kind of discussion about what people ought to know. And, and that often sort of lined up between what you might call a sort of a liberal view of liberal education and a conservative view, which focuses much more on things you should know, right? And it just occurred to me that there are kind of like, as I see what you're talking about here, there are kind of like two levels to this, which is, here are some things to pay attention to. you know, and you can look at those four things about connections and complexity and history and things like that as things to pay attention to. But then there's the question of how do you figure out what to pay attention to when you don't know? And kind of kind of wrestling with that question of kind of looking at things with new eyes and trying to figure out what is significant about the things we're looking at. And I just, I was just kind of intrigued by that, because you could create all kinds of really interesting learning experiences around those kinds of things by kind of putting people in slightly unfamiliar positions, or have us project ourselves into a situation in ways that we wouldn't be used to, or whatever. Anyway, I don't know where that goes, except to say that I think that's an important ability for evaluators to be able to both bring some kind of experience and competency to bear, and on the other hand, to be able to look at things without preconception and try and figure out how to address them that way. So anyway, just sort of random thoughts, but
I think a lot of these things that we're raising kind of speak to that section of the chapter on the shadow side of competencies, and sort of this idea of imposing certain ways of knowing or thinking as, you know, the standard, or even like setting on a minimum bar to achieve. And some of it to me is more of a thinking about like ways of being, you know, how are we, ways of thinking, ways of being in the world as evaluators and as global citizens, and, you know, thinking about different frameworks for understanding the world, and this idea of two-eyed seeing, and you know, how are we shifting, especially those of us who come from the dominant culture, you know, how are we trying to shift to see things from different perspectives, or even like step back and take a back seat when other perspectives need to be heard or prioritized.
Bob, your sort of your thoughts and what you shared, your insights are, we constantly are thinking about those when we're talking to educators. We was talking to a room full of history teachers not that long ago, and you know, you should see what happens when you invite a room to question, like, well, what is knowing? You know, would you, you know, how do you know that you know the complete history of that, or what makes you sure, or how would you invite, you know? So a lot of the inquiry-based models are to do just what you described, to sort of shift away from seeking the answer, and to be able to be a little bit more comfortable in the ambiguity of not necessarily knowing that you can't know, in a way. But yeah, I think that it just resonated with me quite a bit.
It resonated with me as well, Bob. I'm retired now, but I was the director of evaluation here at the University of Illinois in student affairs. And I remember clearly on all the board or director meetings, everyone that spoke out was certain. They had certainty about what was happening in the facts and solutions and so forth. And I remember just struggling, saying there's no such thing as certainty. and I appreciated the notion of doubt, but that might not be satisfactory, but you know, I can live with that. So Bob, I think that notion of what you were talking about is we need to do away with the notion of certainty and about what we do. It's so complex. I also think Diana, you said this, we need to be humble, we need to be resilient, and we need to be open and listening to our colleagues, our friends, our family, and so forth.
Well, I have a question, and I don't know if this is who this is for, but it goes back to, Dana, I think what you said about the fact that you don't have knowledge in here as a category. I think that when Bob made his comment, I thought that's the biggest contrast I've seen, having worked in the education field for years, that was the big thing back in that day. And to this very day, the emphasis is on disciplinary knowledge. And I'm just curious whether you think that there is a body of knowledge in different disciplines, and how people need to learn that, or do we somehow need to not be emphasizing disciplinary knowledge, at least in a singular way?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And one of the ways here's what I will say. I think when World Savvy started 18 years ago, this was the No Child Left Behind era. It was very much a kill and drill sort of, the space for these kind of conversations was very narrow. The number of districts, K-12 districts, schools of ed that are trying to think about these competencies for teachers has accelerated dramatically in the last 5 years, partly because of just migration. Communities are more diverse, they're different, collective majority under 18, and also shifts in the world, obviously. So for me, Beverly, I think that what we focus on is this idea that, yes, knowledge matters, right? You need to have knowledge. You need to be knowledgeable about the subjects. Would you feel comfortable if your doctor or your heart surgeon walked in and was like, what is knowing? I'm going to go in, I'm just going to do some things. We're going to, there's no certainty. I mean, I agree with Tom, but from a disciplinary lens, yes, when you're pursuing expertise and a skill set that allows you to do those things, it makes a whole lot of sense. I would say what World Savvy is trying to get schools to understand is to release their sort of death grip on this certainty about that pool of knowledge that's necessary for kids to succeed, because it really is sort of a farce if you look at the unpredictability of where the future is headed. So has anybody studied Finland's model and where they've moved in the last couple of years on this? Yeah, it looks like Bob. So in a lot of spaces now, Finland said, to your point, what problem in this world could you solve with one set of disciplinary knowledge? Like what complex problem where you're like, it's cool, we'll bring in the mathematician, and then this entire problem will be solved. And so at the core, we work, you will see, it's not in here, but in our guiding principles, our educational approach, interdisciplinary learning is it's essential. It's at the core of all this. So the way Finland rearranged their system was to say, let's teach by topic so that you're required to pull in disciplinary knowledge that is appropriate to explore that topic and move towards a lens of potentially seeing solutions and new perspectives. And so they completely flipped the model that we've had, since the industrial era on its head, where instead of saying, go learn math, they say, go discover, whatever topic, I'm like, my mind is a blank right now, but anything that's a more comprehensive topic, and then they pull in disciplinary pieces. So I think, and what ends up happening, not surprisingly, is graduates of the Finnish system are often, there's a lot of other things happening in Finland that are different from our system, too many to list here, but that you end up having graduates who know how to think. So, and they have the humility that Tom mentions to enter into a situation and know that there's a lot they don't know, and have a set of competencies and tools to approach it from an inquiry-based lens, so they can explore, develop, dive in, and pull in more of that as needed. I think that's, and a lot of schools are shifting to that. It's why you see the rise of, project and inquiry-based learning, maker spaces, student-driven design challenges in schools. We do a lot of them. Things that sort of break down a lot of the preconceived notions around what acquiring knowledge needs to mean. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but the upshot of it is the rigidity for most educational institutions 18 years ago is starting to loosen quite a bit. Because let's be honest, like what we were doing wasn't working. I mean, over the last several decades, like achievement is not getting better in the US, and the gap is getting way worse for students who are living in you know, at least in this country, that's much more diverse than it was.
We have just a few minutes left. Does anyone have a final lingering question or comment that you want to share about this idea of competencies, global competencies, and being world savvy? I think one of the things that I'm, you know, as someone who's trying to help guide the Blue Marble Evaluation Network, one of the things that I'm curious about as members of that network and participants in evaluation at many different levels and places is, what do you feel like would be useful to have access to, or to support your own journeys as becoming world savvy evaluators? What kinds of learning opportunities are you already taking advantage of, or would you like to see Blue Marble support and offer to help you on that journey? I see a book recommendation in the chat. I would love other recommendations of what you're reading, what you listen to, what you'd like, you know, or what you feel like is missing that you would like to see more of. That's a question, so you can get in touch afterwards. You all have my email, I believe. You know, so it's always hard to know how long to let it just be silent on Zoom, but you know, don't want it to be super awkward. But I will say too that it's been almost a year that we've been a sort of formal network. The book came out just under a year ago, and so we are sort of starting to plan 1-year anniversary celebration for Blue Marble Evaluation and the book and the network. And so stay tuned about a date for that. We're working with a few different people to try and settle on a date that is meaningful and works to just celebrate where we've come and look ahead at where we are going. And so some of that involves kind of what people want to see come from this network that we're building to support making sure that evaluation is living into these Blue Marble principles and ecocentric, as Andrea Lisa said, and connected to Indigenous wisdom and looking globally at what's happening, drawing connections between issues, and also working in service toward connecting SDGs and the sustainability of our planet. Dana, do you want to bring us home with any comments?
Just my gratitude. I think, you know, I'm not in the evaluation field, but as Charmaine can say, I feel like I'm a bit of a junkie, and I've been working with Michael and Charmaine since founding. And so I love to just hear how experts in this field are thinking about the integration of these thoughts. So appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for being here and taking the time to, you know,
Yeah.
Dana's always so generous with her time and thinking about where World Savvy is at in their journey. So glad we could share that all with you, and have a great rest of your Friday, wherever you're at in that Friday, and look forward to seeing you all next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.